They called her a nobody before they ever learned her name. In the square of Vila da Prata, under a sun that flattened faces and bleached colors, the boy with the deputy's name on his shirt thought he could make fear into currency. He reached past the stall of an old man who sold tomatoes by the kilo, palms stained with soil, and shoved a palm-sized bill into the man's hand as if payment for silence. The old man, Seoze, clutched the money like a confession and bowed his head. A tomato rolled free from the sack, red and stubborn on a bed of dust. It came to rest at the edge of a shoe, city leather, scuffed, far too neat for that place, and the crowd shifted to watch the stranger who had stepped off the bus that morning. She wore a plain dress, a straw hat pulled low, a gray shawl over one shoulder. Under the hat, her hair was tucked away in a way that made her look like any traveler passing through, earnest and tired. The shawl hid the cut of a city coat. Her hands looked work-worn, as if she had been on the road for days. The disguise was modest by design. The point was anonymity, not theatrics. Junior, the deputy's son, noticed the shoe and the stranger's steady gaze. He laughed, short, dismissive, and thrust the old man aside. "This is not your city, stranger," he said. "Mind your business." The stranger smiled without humor. She bent and picked up the tomato. For a long beat she held it between her fingers, feeling the weight of its skin, the heat of its flesh. Then she turned toward Junior and, simply, offered it back. "You can buy it properly," she said. Her voice was neither loud nor small. It cut the square like a blade folded into daylight. "Or you can let the man have it. You should know better than to take without asking." The laugh stuttered. Around them, a dozen pairs of eyes tracked the exchange, the bakers and the women with baskets, the boy who delivered bread from the lanchonette, the men who fix engines under the corrugated shed. Fear had taught them to watch and say nothing. The square had learned silence as survival. Junior's hand drifted to his belt, a crude signal. Two men, younger and meaner, moved to flank him. The deputy's name was a kind of orbit in that town. His family's reach bent lines of courtesy and law into crooked shapes. But the stranger had a look about her that suggested she did not ask for permission to be anywhere. She stood like an accusation. "You don't know who I am," Junior said. "You don't know who your friends are." "I know the price of tomatoes," she replied. "I know how a man sells what he grows so his children can eat." It wasn't a grand speech. It didn't need to be. A small thing, the tomato, the way she offered it, became a moral test, and for the first time that summer, someone else in the square stepped forward. A woman with a basket of cassava muttered agreement. A boy unfastened his scarf and shifted closer to the stall.
Fear had a hold on them, but courage, when given a shape even as humble as a tomato, could begin to breathe. Junior answered with a shove. The old man stumbled. The stranger's hand landed on her bag, tight, with a gesture that suggested she might be more than a woman who liked to argue with bullies. The boy's face, red with entitlement, curdled into something else, irritation framed by the knowledge that the problem, for once, was not his to resolve alone. "He thinks he's above it," said a voice that had the sandpaper certainty of long endurance. Dona Elvira, retired teacher, proud and small, with a braiding of silver hair, had been watching from a shade near the fountain. She crossed the square with the deliberate pace of someone who had outlived 100 petty tyrannies. When she reached the stranger, she did not bow to politeness. "Who are you to trouble my people?" she asked. Her eyes were sharp. "You could make things worse." The stranger looked from Dona Elvira to the tomato to Seoze. "I'm here to see the truth," she said. "Someone sent me." Whispers climbed like dust. The words, "someone sent me," were small and dangerous, like a match held to dry grass. Bento Siqueira's son scowled. His two henchmen moved a fraction toward his left. The rest of the square exhaled in near silence. He was, of course, a nobody to most of them, a woman wearing a traveler's hat and a single silver chain at her throat. But something in the set of her shoulders carried an authority that did not require a uniform. There was a steadiness to her that suggested either a lack of fear or a well-masked kind of certainty. "You should leave," Junior said, "before you bring trouble." "And if I won't?" The question landed like a pebble in the town pond. Ripples traveled out to the corrugated roofs. "If I came to see—" She paused, and for the first time the square saw no pretense. She was a stranger, yes, but not just that. A memory shadowed her face, a kind of private map. "I came to see why your streets are empty when the deputy's friends pass by." Dona Elvira nodded slowly.
He's taken much. He takes the papers from the cartorio, they say. He makes the land his. She spat words that tasted like aged wood smoke. He keeps people small. A hush fell. In a village where names were the beginning and end of one's insurance, naming the cartorio, the registry office, was to touch a live wire. Bentos Ikeda's power did not only go through muscle, it went through ink and stamp, through forged signatures that could make a cleansed field belong to an outsider. It went through men with guns, yes, but it had the sanctification of fake paperwork behind it. Junior laughed again, but his voice wobbled. The stranger tucked the tomato back into her bag, then straightened and looked toward the lane that led out of the square, toward the road where buses came and went. I have a message, she said. Tell your father that someone is watching what he does.
Tell him a judge will look into his deeds. There was a silence so sudden it felt like the square had been slapped. A number of things are possible in rural towns when someone mentions a judge. A judge in the city is an abstract force. A judge in person is trouble. People don't usually invite trouble. They avoid it as they avoid the midday heat. But the stranger's certainty, her refusal to be cowed by Junior's theatrics, breathed into other chests like oxygen. You could be lying, Junior said. He forced the words into a grin that tried to disguise a growing dread. Who sent you? Who gave you information? Her hand moved, just once, inside her bag. The gesture was small. It didn't reveal a badge or any instrument of a judicial office. She drew out a slip of paper, folded and thin, and handed it to Dona Elvira with the care of someone treating a relic. Dona Elvira unfolded it with fingernails that had worked through decades of chalk dust and stove smoke. The name she read was not handwritten, in the messy scrawl of one who fears reprisal. It was typed, clinical, and at the bottom a set of coordinates and the word confidential. They said the cartorio kept originals behind a false wall, Dona Elvira read aloud. They said forged deeds carry the deputy's stamp. They said many were forced to sign away their land. It said someone named Afonso had tried to stop it. At that name, the stranger's face changed completely. For a breath, the crowd saw a private loss lick the edge of a public mission. Afonso de Menezes. The name pulled a shutter down in their own memories. He had been the escriván, the clerk, once respected and then murdered, and his death had been a rumor with a date and no justice. The town had accepted his loss as another consumable of their Knight in the Knife's life. Annabella Menezes had not told anyone in the square her full name, but the name Dona Elvira read made a loose threat taut. If rumors have a body, Afonso's murder was its bone. The paper trembled slightly in Dona Elvira's fingers, and she clutched the stranger's hand as if to anchor a boat. You are not the first to ask, Annabella, or the stranger said, though she did not offer her surname. But I am the first who will not come with a prosecutor's pomp. I'm coming with a bag and shoes and a camera. If I am taken for a fool, at least I'll be a fool in the open. It was a dangerous admission. To call herself a judge in that square, openly, would have been the kindling of a collapse, but she did not call herself a judge. She called herself a traveler who carried a camera. And yet the square understood what she had said. Someone, somewhere, had fed her the town's wound. Be quiet, whispered Dona Elvira, glancing toward the narrow street where the deputy's minions often lingered. You will bring worse if you shout. You will not take him alone. I will not take him alone. The stranger's voice was matter-of-fact.
She folded the paper and thrust it into her bag, then stepped away. She moved toward the lanternette, toward the coffee that tastes like ground hope in that town, and a little world rearranged itself around her. People watched as if a storm had been forecast and the first cloud had appeared. She passed beneath a painted sign that read Prefettura, though its letters had been softened by weather. Names like that gave a town legitimacy. In Vila da Prata, the letters were a stain of something that might once have been helpful. Now they were an ironic frame for the deputy's shadow. Later, when the stranger sat on a bench with a cup of coffee that steamed in the heat, Dona Elvira leaned close. They say he bought the cartorio down by the river, she told the stranger. The man at the desk is not the man it was. The tabelion was bought. The notary that stamps the paper. Someone else moves his hand. Annabella, she would be Annabella to some and a stranger to others, listened. She unwrapped a small recorder from the folds of her shawl and let the tape run. Not to prove something to the town, to prove something to herself. Evidence had the virtue of being stubborn, words were not. Her plan was not to march into the square with a dossier and a siren. She had been a judge long enough to know that evidentiary law is a kind of slow, cold discipline. It does not require headline moments as much as it requires documents that do not lie under cross-examination. Originals, stamps, signatures, seals, the weight of an ink pressed to paper. The anonymous tip had been vague in some places and precise in others.
It suggested that the cartorio, an old brick building with a rusted plaque, kept original land registries locked behind a false inner wall. The forgeries, it said, bore the deputy's mark and had been used to transfer property to shell corporations and to friends. The tip had included a line that read, "Look for Afonso's handwriting. He kept his initials on the margins as a habit." That detail had been unnecessary and essential at once. It was unnecessary because the town's pain needed no code. It was essential because a small personal habit, an escrivand or initialed margins, offered a breadcrumb in the sleight of forged hands. 12 years were the wound of Afonso's death. She had not wept in the bench. Judges did not weep on the bench. They archived. They translated grief into filings. But grief is not a book. It is a drum that beats until you do something about it. She chose disguise, not to hide courage, but to avoid spectacle that would warn men like Bento and undo the evidence.
A judge walking in under an escort would have triggered the moment Bento needed to burn or bury records. A judge in the square, announced like a proclamation, would have sent the deputy's men to sweep the cartorio clean that night. So she took bus timetables, thrift-stored clothes, a camera that fit as easily in a palm as a coin. She left official escort in the city. She switched off the circuits of formal protection because the greater protection would be stealth, the law in slow work. On the bus, the countryside unspooled in its patient grammar, maize fields like folded hands, cows in slow meditation, a horizon that was honest and blunt. Annabella watched the landscape and rehearsed questions, the legal equivalent of breathing exercises. She thought of the protocols for chain of custody, how to photograph without contaminating, how to log timestamps, how to secure chain of evidence notes in a way that would be admissible if a defense attorney tried to tear the paper to pieces in court. She checked her devices. Recorder, microcamera hidden in a button on her shawl, a small flash drive encrypted with a password she would not carry on paper. She had no weapon. She was not there to fight. She was there to gather. At the bus stop, a child yelled out a name. "Annabella? Is that you?" A pause. The town is intimate in ways a city never is. Names travel like weather. She slowed, and for a second the child's question looked like a trap, but he only wanted to offer a hand with the bag. That small kindness registered like a light. Her first night she slept in a rented room above the lanchoneta. The owner, a woman who wore worry like a belt, took her money and gave her a key. The room smelled faintly of coffee grounds and lemon oil. In the mirror, she practiced walking as an ordinary person, not a judge. A city judge's gait has the gravity of a courthouse behind it. A stranger's gait is lighter, less entombed with precedent. She practiced that lighter step until the practice shape looked more natural than the heavy one. By morning, she had a name for herself at the marketplace, Anna, or Annabella to the few who listened. People felt safe to call her by pieces of that name because a full name could be dangerous, and danger makes people careful about calling things by their fullest name. Dona Elvira became her first true ally, not because she had anything to gain, but because courage and memory are contagious. Over coffee and boiled eggs that tasted like sunlight, they made small plans. Dona Elvira drew a map on a scrap of paper with a pen that shook from the urgency of old hands. She pointed to the cartorio, down by the canal where the river bent like a sleeping animal. She said the deputy visited there often in the mornings. Valdir is his shadow, she said. Valdir is the one to watch. Valdir. The name came with a face, a large man with a scar that seemed to have a story and no end. Bento Sekira had a network that ran like roots under the town.
Valdir handled the muscle. Junior handled the public posturing, and somewhere behind the facade of the cartorio and a smiling notary who signed without reading, a system of forged papers threaded itself into the earth. The day she went to the cartorio, she moved with the careful attention of someone conducting a quiet arrest of a moment. The cartorio looked like a building that had been designed to make people feel small. Its sign was brass and dulled with neglect. A small bell tinkled when she stepped in, and the clerk, a man with a mouth that preferred money to truth, looked up. "Can I help you?" he asked, the words sliding like oil over the table. "I need to see the registry," she said. "I'm doing a survey of old titles. I'm looking for documents from 20 years ago. The name Afonso de Menezes may appear." The clerk squinted. His fingers disappeared into a drawer. "We have limited records," he answered. "Some were transferred, some—" He paused. "You should speak to the tabelion. He will schedule you for a formal request." Formality is a slow thing in Brazilian bureaucracy. Sometimes it is a shield for theft. Annabella had expected a gate, and so she carried with her the kind of small deceptions detectives and judges sometimes use when the law must be coaxed into the open. She left the cartorio on the pretense of returning later and walked alone to the edge of town, where the river hummed against its banks.
She waited until a courier left with a bag of petitions and followed him with the cautious patience of a fox. At night she visited the Cartorio again. The city of Vila da Prata slept in no hurry. The night was a velvet hand. She watched the building, studied the angles of the windows, the shadow where the foundation met the earth, the single lantern that sometimes sputtered. Intelligence, she reminded herself, is the art of noticing what others have made invisible. Her first break came from a detail the tip had insisted upon, the false wall. Cartorios are repositories of trust. They are both mundane and sacred in their procedures. They keep the history of who owns what, and in small towns that history can be the only tether between a family and its livelihood. To move the true books is to shift the town's memory. She observed the clerk delivering a set of records to a man who smelled of cheap whiskey and avarice. The man left the bag in his truck and took a call. The pair lingered in conversation like two wolves discussing a trap. When the clerk came back inside, he moved with the slow confidence of someone who knows he won't be watched. Annabella had a plan, small, careful, legal in its aims, but clandestine in method. She waited until the clerk left to use the restroom, timed the door's creak and the patter of rain against the corrugated roof like a metronome. She slipped inside, fingers steady against the wood of the door. The desk had a stack of municipal forms, a coffee ring, a small plaque with a name, clean handwriting.
She opened a drawer and found nothing of consequence. The real records, she believed, would be in the inner room, behind where the sunlight did not reach. The Cartoria's inner room smelled of paper, mildew, and the faint sweet of old glue. Files sat in metal cabinets. They made a library of other people's lives. Annabella moved through them like a person traversing graves. Her microcamera, hidden in the button of her shawl, recorded everything she saw, time-stamped and encrypted. She wore thin gloves so the pages wouldn't bear her prints. Her training insisted on exactitude. This was not the theater of surprise arrests. This was the patient labor of assembling a case. She opened a ledger at random. The pages were full of cramped pen hand, signatures stamped in blue. There, in a margin, a small initial, AM, scrawled, almost unconsciously, the kind of mark a diligent escrivain makes. Her breath softened. She photographed the page, and the photo's metadata pinged into a secure folder on her device. Then she felt it, a hollow beneath the tile floorboard, a draft that suggested a space behind a wall. She probed the lower skirting, and with the prying of a small screwdriver she had brought wrapped in cloth, she loosened a slat. The brick behind was different. It had been smoothed and relaid. Dust choked the air in a small throat of a cavity. Her hand scraped at the edge and found a seam. Behind the falsified surface lay a thin door, and when she forced it open, the air that escaped smelled like old varnish and secrets. The cavity was narrow, but deep enough to hold a ledger. At the back, wrapped in oilcloth, were books, the thick backs of registries, leather cracked but labeled with year and the same handwriting she had seen in the margin. Her heart did not pound. It did something quieter and more canalized. Each ledger she pulled loose was heavier than the last, and she carried them to the little desk where she set them down like the laying of a stern verdict. There, in the dimness, she broke protocol only enough to look. She flipped through pages, watched the names roll by like a town's funeral. Then she found a page, one of the original deeds, bearing an official stamp and a signature she recognized by habit rather than memory, the neat, ascetic hand of a man who had written his initials in margins. Afonso's initials stared up, a small defiant flourish in the gulf of forged signatures. Beside the ledger, folded and clipped to a stack, were other papers, copies with different ink, with a round blue stamp that matched the deputy's known seal. Beside them sat a set of typed transactions, all transferring land to a small set of companies nobody in Vila da Prata had heard of before. The forged transfers had official-looking seals and notarized statements, but the handwriting of Afonso that verified ownership was present in the originals, and where the forgeries bore the deputy's stamp, the originals bore initials and dates that contradicted the transfers.
She photographed each page. The camera's mechanical click felt small in the stillness. Each image she took, she immediately uploaded to an encrypted cloud, protocol she had arranged before leaving the city, with the metadata carrying GPS coordinates and timestamps. Her file names were clinical, the sort designed to make a paper trail a courtroom certainty. Registry 1998, Menezes, page 23.jpg. Deed transfer 2004, bentosekira.pdf. Evidence needs labels, because the law discards the nurse of emotion for the nurse of process. Pages whispered as she turned them. The sound of paper was a kind of liturgy. There were names of families who had been in those fields for generations. There were signatures of men who no longer lived. She paused at a transfer that bore Afonso's note in the margin. Returned to original owner, pending. A hand had tried to preserve rectitude, and someone had butchered it for profit. As she worked the night, the cartorio outside was quiet, but not empty of life. Somewhere in the town, a dog barked. A window shutter clicked. She kept time with her recorder, which caught her whispering notes to herself. Found false wall, originals present, several forged transfers with matching stamps, photographs uploaded, need to secure physical books, emergency extraction plan B. She wrapped the ledgers with oilcloth and slid them into a satchel lined with linen. A plan coalesced. Get the originals into safe custody, then call in a formal federal convoy. That would be the lawful way. Yet every time she imagined a convoy driving in, the deputy's men would know exactly when to move the papers elsewhere. The only way to guarantee the book's preservation was to remove them quietly and to create duplicates so flawless that the deputy and his lawyers could not claim tampering. She thought about protocols, not because she wanted to be theatrical, but because if she failed the chain of custody, a man like Bento could walk. Evidence, in court, dies on small errors, an unlogged glove, an unnoted timestamp. Judges and prosecutors are good at finding gaps. She was a judge. She had to anticipate how someone like Bento would try to unwind the case. So she planned. She would carry the originals to a place where they would be safe, and then bring the copies forward as exhibits. She would make sure every image carried a notarized timeline if needed. She would sign her own acts and seal them. She would, in short, be thorough. As she turned the last of the books, she found something small, a torn photograph tucked in between pages, the kind that gets saved by habit. The photograph showed a man standing in front of a whitewashed house, smiling as if nothing had happened. Written in faded ink on the back was an initial and a date, Afonso and a summer that had been stolen. Annabella held the photograph like a relic. The photograph contained no answers, but it contained a face she loved and a face that had been taken. She slid it into her pocket.
A slow creak at the door made her head tilt. She hadn't heard anyone enter. Her hand went to the recorder, and she checked her pockets. Camera, flash drive, the little toolkit she carried, the folded map Dona Elvira had drawn. Her mind, trained in procedure and anticipation, accounted for contingencies with a clean, terrible arithmetic. One person in the town could see the light from the cartorio if they turned a certain corner. One person could notice a window not closed. One person could report an odd van lingering. She stood as if to leave, and then stopped. She thought of chain of custody again, and of how an honest chain is made of not just documents, but people who can testify about how those documents were handled. She needed witnesses who could later say, under oath, that these were the books and these were the pages. She needed somebody to be outside who could be trusted. Dona Elvira had said she would find someone, Tiago. He was a young man who delivered groceries and had worked at the Lanchonete. He was, the teacher assured her, restless and watching. He had eyes that didn't quite fit into Bento's world. People like Tiago were useful in two ways. They moved in the town without raising suspicion, and they often saw what older men had learned to hide. She fumbled for the small radio that would allow her to reach a prearranged signal. She had set up an emergency protocol before leaving the city. Quiet, clinical instructions on a card kept in her wallet, with the word indefinido penciled at the bottom for procedural steps that couldn't be invented on the fly. But the radio's battery showed a low blink. The town's electricity was cyclical and unreliable. Not everything the city can promise will hold in the country. She decided on a staggered plan. She would move the most incriminating volumes to a secure hiding place, then come back and take the rest. She would leave the microcamera recording until her last breath in that room. A sensible, careful plan, until the sound of footsteps approached the cartorio door from the outside in a way that suggested company, not the clerk. The handle moved. Annabella pressed herself into the shadow between shelves. She wrapped the satchel closer to her chest with one thin, controlled motion. The door opened and a silhouette stepped in. The clerk, yes, but with two more men behind him. One of the men smelled of rust and sweat. The other had the quick, predatory calm of someone who had decided to control a room with fewer words. Valdir's face moved in her mind like an omen. They spoke in hushed tones. The clerk must have expected some late-night queries or a routine audit. The two men behind him carried the purposeful gait of those who make sure audits never reveal anything inconvenient. As they swept past the outer desk, their bodies cast long shadows. The cartorio's bulb hanging by a wire swayed slightly and threw a stuttering light that made the pages shiver. Annabella did not move.
Her body shrank to the size of a small, tenacious secret. She watched them move through the aisles as if they were wolves inspecting a pen. One of them, Valdir perhaps, paused near the narrow seam where she had pried out the slat. He touched the floorboard with a gloved hand and smiled at nothing in particular, a smile as occupied as a man who has no intent to lie to himself. Hide, Dona Elvira had told her days before in the market, and she tried to obey, but even as she clutched the satchel, she felt the weight of the ledgers like the weight of the past pressing at her collarbone. Then a small sound, too slight to be decisive, but enough, a cough from one of the men, a chat about a woman they had seen that morning. The clerk's voice, the same that asked for fees and comforted mourners, was low and oily. "We have a delivery tomorrow," he said. "The deputy needs new papers. He wants them ready by morning." The words were a match. A plan that had been careful and patient snapped, and something harder settled in Annabella's body. If she stayed, she could be taken, and the books could be rolled up like a map and carried somewhere no one would find. If she left, she could lose the only proof she had. Her hand tightened on the strap. She slid from her hiding place and moved, slow as a breath, toward the door. The men were between her and the night, and the satchel's weight was an honest metronome. At the threshold, her foot brushed a piece of paper. It fluttered, then folded under the toe of one of the men. He stooped, picked it up, and his face went different colors. The man showed it to the clerk, a flyer with a name, the name of the deputy's company, with a phone number. The flyer had been intended for something else, a town fair. The man laughed, but it was thin. "Someone's meddling," he said. "Someone came in here today." Annabella's palms were flat to her side. She wanted to shrug on innocence like a cloak. She thought for a hung second of the recorder's red light pulsing in the darkness. She thought of the microcamera buttons stitched in her shawl's cloth, and how it had already captured their faces. The plan to remove the books had turned into a knife point. The room shrank. The toughest part of being a judge is how many options you must see and then set aside because they won't survive the law. She had rehearsed actions in her mind like prayers. Now everything depended on the small art of bluff. When the man approached the doorway with a kind of proprietorial menace, she stepped out and met him with a face as plain as bread. "Oh," she said, "I think I dropped something." Her voice was casual, the voice of someone who imagines mistakes are more often accidental than malevolent. The men narrowed their eyes. Valdir's face with his scar read the new arrival with muscle memory. "You're the one from the square," Valdir said. He was a voice without humor. "I asked questions," she answered.
"I asked where the old records were kept. I am looking for a signature, a man named Afonso. He used to be here. He wrote small initials." Valdir laughed then, sharp and too quick. "A man like that brings trouble," he said. "You are curious for a woman alone." She did not refute the remark. Instead, she breathed out like someone who carries a long reserve. "I have a camera," she said. "I make records for my study. I look into things people forget." Valdir's hand moved not to a weapon, but to the small of his back, near a phone. The room seemed to constrict. The clerk watched them with something like a long-suffering foreshadow, as if he had been expecting a night like this. The men closed ranks. The air hummed with the quiet violence of intent. This was the moment when an ordinary person might have fled. Annabella did not flee. She had left behind a life of public pronouncements for the precise reason that the rule of law sometimes requires proximity to darkness. She had not come to be theatrical. She had come to document. "You're wasting your time," she said softly, but her words had the blade of consequence. "If you hide the originals, it will only make things worse. People will remember who took them." Two of the men's hands drifted to their belts. Valdir shrugged, not the casual shrug of dismissal, but the shrug of a man who carries too many decisions in a single wrist. The clerk wiped his hands on his trousers and said, "We will call the deputy." Annabella's chest tightened. The radio in her bag flashed a tiny distress signal, a low prearranged code that would, if picked up correctly, mean retrieval required. The signal, she had hoped, would reach not a tactical unit at once. She had no illusions about the time that would take, but an ally, perhaps Tiago, perhaps Dona Elvira, perhaps someone who would stand at the edge of the cartorio and make noise to buy a breathing minute. The radio's battery clicked and then held. Her backup plan was not a miracle. It was the patient conversion of data into stubborn evidence. "Call him," she said. "Call the deputy. Let him see what is here. Let him see the books." Her voice matched the small fury she carried. She wanted to provoke Bento into revealing himself, to force his hand. If Bento came, his arrogance would be a tool. Men like Bento like to stomp where they can be seen. They fear being proved small. The clerk hesitated. He shuffled paper like a man handling guilt. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "There are consequences to meddling." "There are consequences to stealing," Annabella replied, "and to hiding those consequences in a false wall." The clerk's mouth worked. Valdir stepped toward her. One motion. The men behind him braced like a chorus waiting for the cue. At the cartorio door,
The night air from the square seemed to press against them like a question. Somewhere, far enough that it could seem accidental, a motorcycle idled and then moved.
The sound of it slipping past the lanchonette seemed like a clock. "You're not a local," Valdir said. "You think you can come and take what belongs to us?" She looked toward the window and the faint glint of a distant lamp. For a second, she allowed herself a private calculation. The odds that anyone in the town would help a stranger against the deputy and his men. They were not in her favor. But the human ledger is complicated. Money does not always buy courage, and courage can sometimes be bought with the simple fact of another person deciding not to be silent. "Belongs to who?" she asked. "To people who worked the land for generations, or to a list of companies that don't exist in any real way? Who signs for a house if the real owner is dead? Who stands up when papers lie for the sake of power?" The question lingered. The men did not answer with words. They answered with closing of ranks, and the clerk took a step toward the back, toward a telephone. Annabella had been a judge long enough to know the arc of power. Where menace is strongest is where evidence is least visible. She needed to secure the ledgers, but she also needed to secure testimony. She stepped toward Valdir, as if to offer an arm in a ridiculous formal gesture of peace. "Listen," she said quietly. "If you let me leave with these volumes, I will." "You will what?" Valdir snapped. "Destroy us with paper?" No, the phrase died in her mouth. She had no intention of threatening with theatrical wording. She was a judge, not an avenger. "I will take them to a lawyer who will ensure rightful claims," she said. "I will make certain the town can prove its ownership." Valdir's hand tightened. The clerk had the telephone in his hand and did not yet make the call. The men behind Valdir closed in, like the pressure around a grape before it's crushed. At that exact moment, the lanchonette's door burst open. Dona Elvira stood there, breathless, eyes wide, and behind her, a shadow moved. Tiago, young and uncertain, who had watched the cartorio for days at a distance. He held nothing, and his face was the face of someone who lived in the amber of a choice. "Leave her," Dona Elvira shouted, into the small room like a bell convulsing. Valdir's head turned. For a breath, the room held a skittish balance. The clerk's hand trembled over the telephone. Tiago's presence was small, perhaps even insignificant in the larger calculation. But his voice as he called out, "Annabella, get out," was a drop of water that might force an answer. The men moved first. Valdir stepped in front of Valdir, folding his broad back as a shield. One of the younger men reached for Dona Elvira, as if to shove her back into the doorway. His fingers closed on her sleeve. The teacher's face did not change, except for the quick hardening of her jaw. Tiago moved like someone deciding to become a different kind of man.
He stepped between the boy and the older woman, palms open, as if to mark a boundary that had never existed in that town. "Leave her," Tiago said, voice thin but straight. Valdir's grin disappeared. He smelled confrontation the way some men smell rain and bad weather. The room tightened. The clerk's hand finally left the telephone, a half-made call cooling in his palm. For an instant, the cartorio was a place where ordinary things happened under the ordinary compromise of fear. Then Annabella did what she had prepared only in rehearsals. She let her face go soft with fatigue, the look of someone worn from travel and paperwork. "If you must call someone," she said, "call whoever you like. The books are already gone." The words worked like a pivot. Valdir's head cocked. "What do you mean gone?" he said. "You took them?" "Not with my hands." Her voice was small, precise. "They're in a place they can't be moved tonight. I left evidence of their existence and of these transfers in a place the city cannot ignore. You can call the deputy now, and he can order men to go dig at the wrong place, while what matters is safely elsewhere. You can call him and tell him everything is fine. Or you can do what men like him always do, burn what they cannot own without being seen." Valdir's fist found his belt as if for a weapon. He thought for a moment of burning the cartorio, of erasing paper as he had erased people's lives. The clerk swallowed. Somewhere outside someone shouted, 2 syllables, not loud enough to shape the town, but loud enough to be heard like a pulse. It might have been Tiago's cousin on a motorbike.
It might have been a chicken startled into truth. The moment split. Valdir snapped. He grabbed Annabella's arm, not roughly, but with a grip that assured she would be compliant. "Then you will come with us," he said. "You will tell your trick. You will tell us who put you on our doorstep." Dona Elvira made a small, quick sound of protest, and then something else, slow and deliberate. She took hold of Valdir's sleeve with knobby fingers and tugged him close. "Heard enough," she said. "Let her go. Listen to a woman of this town when she says the wrong night to make enemies is tonight. You'll all be seen." It was a surprisingly modest safeguard, an old woman's voice substituting for the law. Valdir hesitated, the old calculation of risk and reward passing through his face like a storm cloud. He let go of Annabella slowly, like a man reconsidering a wager. But the reprieve lasted only a breath. The clerk's face had gone placid with the habit of dodging trouble, and his hand made a small, decisive motion toward the back room. Valdir's men closed in, blocking exits, their shoulders forming a rough ring. Tiago's jaw worked as if he were chewing a pebble of courage. The men were not exactly ready for violence. What they were ready for was intimidation and disappearance.
They prepared to make Annabella disappear into the network that had kept Vila da Prata obedient for years. Annabella had no illusions about what would follow. She had planned for this possibility as if it were a weather event, callable, dangerous, countable. Her fingers brushed the recorder in her shawl and then slid to the small button that would start transmitting a prearranged signal. The battery's light blinked once. She had an emergency protocol encoded into the device. It would not summon a miracle, but it would set in motion the slow grind of federal attention she needed, the only kind of force that could turn paper into arrests. When Valdir's hand closed on her arm again and the men began to lead her out into the night, she allowed herself a single glance at Dona Elvira. The teacher's face held a mixture of defiance and worry. Tiago's eyes met hers for a second, an exchange that carried a load of unspoken choices. She nodded just once, a small acknowledgement that the fate she carried was not private. It elbowed into the communal ledger. They bound her hands with coarse rope in the back of a pickup beneath a sky the color of old tin. The town slid past in a sequence of dim shapes, the Lanchonete's shutter, the fountain that had seen generations, the bridge over the river. Men on the street pulled their collars up against curiosity. A few closed their shutters. The deputy's men worked in efficient, practiced silence. They were not bullies who needed to shout. Their power lay in the shape of their passivity, the night's quiet that allowed them to move like a claim across the town. Annabella kept her face even. The rope bit her wrists, but her hands did not tremble. She counted time by the engine's rhythm. She whispered into her shawl months, an unconscious habit. Found originals, backups uploaded, recorder active. Small sentences like these were stabilizers. They transformed fear into action. They drove her across the turnpike to the deputy's fazenda. The land that Bento had turned into a showpiece of ownership lay like an island of neat, stern hedges and painted walls. The sugar mill, an old ingenio, sat at the property's center like a monument to colonial power, its brickwork scorched with the memory of industry and exploitation. Near the gate, a rusted plaque announced the estate's name in fading letters. The deputy's name had been painted in an assertive black that tried to make permanence out of transgression. At the gate, Junior waited, all youth without training, wearing the deputy's reputation like a trophy. He had a swagger that dissolved when the truck stopped and Annabella was handed down. He circled her like a dog assessing meat, then tried to deliver the small public humiliation crocheted into his upbringing. "Thought you'd run off with our proofs, did you?" he sneered. Annabella met his gaze without concession. "I didn't take anything you could show the public," she said, "but I recorded the truth."
The words fell into the cool diesel night. Junior's face warped. He had, perhaps, never been asked to defend his father's name in the presence of a woman who had the look of someone who would be heard in court. His bravado was brittle. Inside the Añejo, the air tasted of rust, sugar dust, and cheap whiskey. Portraits of donors and former mayors hung on the walls. Their faces had the kind of light that comes from power absorbed over years. The interior was a theater for wealth. Carved furniture, a long table, chairs that had known men who preferred deals to argument. At the end of the room, a small bar offered the lingering scent of lime and stale cigarettes. Bento Siqueira arrived like a man walking into a stage he had set for himself. He carried his power with a practiced swagger and a belt of legalese, the kind of man who had learned to dress his theft in the language of legitimacy. He wore a shirt wide enough to be scandalous
and a smile that could be turned into menace with a single glance. "You made trouble," Bento said, voice warm with the confidence of someone who believed in impunity. "You come into my town making claims and you expect me to tremble?" Annabella did not reply with the dramatic reveal. She let her silence become a device. Bento's eyes flicked to the rope on her wrists and then to the satchel at her feet, as if ready to seize anything valuable. His hands folded on his chest like a man whose fingers had been taught to keep score. "Who sent you?" Bento asked, not because he expected an answer, but to shape the narrative. Someone playing grand with the law. She looked at him with a kind of tired amusement. "Someone who loves the truth," she said, "and someone who loved Afonso Menezes." At that name, the room inhaled. Bento's face imperceptibly tightened, like a man who had been touched by a memory he had tried to bury. Men who build empires of terror learn to compartmentalize murders in ledger entries, but names can be like picklocks on old doors. Afonso's name was a door that opened on a past pattern Bento had worked to make permanent. "You knew him?" Bento barked. "I knew enough," Annabella replied. "He kept the original books. He tried to stop transfers to shell companies. He paid for it." A laugh escaped Bento, the kind that was not the sound of amusement so much as the sound of someone trying to deny a rumor. "Do you have proof? Where is it? Did some poor woman in the square hide your contrivance in the mud?" Valdir moved to the satchel and kicked it, more to mark possession than to find content. Tiago's shoulders tightened. He had not wanted this. He had wanted simpler things than being pressed into the photos of men who forced people off their land. For a long second his eyes tracked the satchel and the rope. The satchel sat where gravity had put it, innocent, unreadable to men who refused to see. Annabella let the silence sit like a fact. Then she offered a small, dangerous smile.
"The recorder is on," she said. "It has been for hours." Valdir scoffed. "Miracles don't happen." "Not miracles," Annabella corrected. "Just persistence." She motioned with her chin toward the satchel. "The books are not here, but what I have will make a court interested before the sun rises." That moment did what she intended. Bento's face, assuming indifference, warmed into calculation. If a court was to be interested, it would start with a complaint. Someone with documents to submit, a prosecutor to mobilize. But Annabella had not simply brought a complaint. She had brought small pieces of work. Photographs uploaded to an encrypted cloud, each file carrying a timestamp and a GPS coordinate. Micro-camera footage showing hands and faces. A recorded confession in progress when a man was least vigilant. Bento's jaw worked. He gestured for his men to start a search. Locked rooms swung open. Drawers were pried. The house answered with the clumsy, efficient violence of a machine built to hide evidence. Men with cuffs and cruel smiles combed through boxes, while bored boys rifled the drawers. Junior reversed his swagger into the simple ferocity of someone ordered to do a task. Annabella felt Valdir's hand close on the satchel, as if to wrest it open. She let herself relax just enough to let the man think he was in charge. Men like Valdir need the illusion of control because their lives are otherwise small and regimented. She wanted him to feel in control until he discovered he was not. He undid the satchel with a flippant motion, knowing that whatever was inside would be either money or seeds of trouble. The man expected bills and a confirmation of power. What he found was a set of old ledger copies and a small folded note. He frowned and flipped through the pages. Annabella watched his face change from arrogance to a slow, private panic. "What is this?" he grunted. "Copies," Annabella said. "High-resolution copies linked to an external server. Originals in a safe place. These copies carry metadata that matches the time and place they came from." Valdir's mouth made a thin line. "So they can claim anyone wrote that." "They can try," Annabella said, "but each file has an address. Each page has a scanner's imprint. Each image has metadata that ties back to this building. You have men who will testify these books existed. You have the notary's own stamp. And when the federal team asks for the originals, they will know what to look for." The men clustered like fish around a bait. Bento's laugh had a new edge, less confidence, more calculation. He signaled to one of his men to fetch the deputy's phone. The men retreated briefly to set a stage in the living room where Bento could deliver performance, and in that gap something fragile in the air shifted. Tiago stepped back. He had been a courier. He had carried groceries and news and other people's secrets. He had learned that secrets wear a certain thinness when you are young.
He had seen the land lose its names and had watched faces go out of windows. Annabella's quiet courage had loosened whatever strings had tied him to the town's silence. He moved to the edge of the room and dropped his voice, barely audible, a confession to the nearest thing approximating conscience. "You shouldn't be doing this," he said, not to Bento, but to Valdir. "He doesn't own everything. Valdir struck the table in irritation. "Silence, boy." The hand on the table left an imprint. Bento returned, and with all the cultivated gentleness of arrogant men, sat near Annabella and leaned in as if to read a private letter. "You must be clever," he said to her. "An actress, perhaps. Who did you call? Which city magistrate sent you with a camera?" Annabella let her disguise fit for a moment. She played the role of woman alone who had wandered into a nest and found it fertile with rot. "I have no one from the city here," she said. "Only what I have and what I can show you. There is no need for your theatrics. These papers show transfers to companies you control. They show notaries who signed without witnesses. They show payments that I can trace to accounts in your name." Bento smiled like a man who believed he had a narrative to flatten her into. "Even if you have papers," he said, "do you think a judge will believe a stranger who planted them and then claimed to be a judge? Who will testify you didn't plant them yourself?" Annabella's pulse ticked like a precise metronome. "Someone will," she said, "and the recordings will show whether voices say what they say." That night the ingenio became a stage for erosion. Men opened drawers and found nothing that could not be explained away. They took what looked important to them, small cash boxes, ledgers of payments in cash, receipts for deliveries. But the men were pulling at threads rather than fabric. The copies in Annabella's satchel were not the kind of thing a man could dismiss with a shrug. They came back to the satchel again and again, as if the satchel were a tiny, increasing storm. Bento decided on a spectacle. He would force a confession. He would get the woman to sign a paper, to confess to forgery, to reveal who the instigators were, and then he would shape their story into one where she was the liar and he the aggrieved man defending his land. Theater in these parts has long replaced truth. He ordered them to drive Annabella to the ingenio's old processing chamber, a high-ceilinged room with cement floors and iron pulleys. There he would extract the truth by intimidation and by spectacle. Arguments about law and procedure were for men who feared the consequences of their actions publicly. Bento wanted to perform the consequence privately. They moved her through anvil-like corridors saturated with the smell of old sugar and oil, gunmetal glinting in someone's waistband. The night seemed to move slower than the truck's engine allowed. The deputy's men laughed occasionally to fill silent spaces.
Junior kept circling like someone testing a new knife. At the ingenio, they forced Annabella to her knees near a rusting tank. The men crouched to assert dominance, their voices the low, possessive hum of men used to being listened to. They wanted her to produce the names that would allow them to follow the trail and crush any spark of organized opposition. They wanted to find the city hand in the town's affairs. Annabella kept her face as a slate. She refused to be baited into confessions that were not hers. She declined to be made into spectacle. Men like Bento want an audience, somewhere to display that he can bend the law to his will. He sought a public scare to keep the rest of Vila da Prata quiet. What he didn't anticipate was that men make mistakes when they believe themselves omnipotent. Security, when it rests on the assumption that no one in town wants to risk anything, is brittle. And Annabella was not without friends in the community. She had spent days earning tiny confidences that now became channels of light. Tiago, whose movement had once been timid, found a way to slip from the room. He moved along the ingenio's outer walls like someone retrieving courage from the earth. He was raw and terrified, but he had something like a conviction growing in him, that remaining small had cost people their land and their history. He had seen Dona Elvira arrive at the cartorio and knew deep in his gut that what Annabella had done, what she had risked, had been for something other than spectacle. He crept past the outer gate where a single sentry nodded to the moon. Tiago had learned the fazenda's routes delivering eggs and bread. He knew the guards' shift patterns, the way the dogs woke and slept. He slipped to the lanchonete and took a phone, calling the one number Annabella had given Dona Elvira before she left the city, the backup number for the federal contact she had arranged. The number was not public. It was a thread in the net she had baited. He dialed with a child's urgency. On the other end, far from the ingenio and the sugar-scented air of the fazenda, Commander Neves checked the feed on a small screen. He had been briefed months ago in the dusty neutral language of operations, a complaint about land grabbing, possible threats to evidence, a federal judge going into the field. The briefing was unsettling because judges rarely infiltrate. It required care and discretion. The chain of command had not expected Annabella to go alone, but when Tiago's shaky call whispered into the team's ear, the gravity changed. The signal she had sent earlier, short, coded, had already registered as a low-priority alert. Tiago's human call elevated it to actionable status. Neves is a man habituated to the precise ballet of logistics. He did not leap at once into action. He counted and cross-checked.
He called in a small tactical group, the kind that moves fast and aims to minimize bloodshed.
He requested aerial insertion. A helicopter like an industrial Blackbird would give them speed and the sight that had been missing. He set rules of engagement carefully: minimize lethal force, secure evidence, arrest with chains rather than bullets, unless lives were at risk. When the chopper left the city, its rotors threw a wind that smelled faintly of oil and ozone. The team inside read their dossiers and rehearsed entry. They had photos of Bento, of Valdir, of key men in Bento's network. Commander Neves carried the file with the names of the companies. He thought of procedure like a surgeon thinks of incisions: make them quick and precise, and have a team ready to stitch the wound. He believed the law could act like medicine when applied with skill. Back at the Ingenio, Annabella continued to play a dangerous game. Bento had tried to provoke her into anger, into the kind of moment that could be used against her. He wanted her to slip, to reveal that she was anything but the simple woman he could humiliate. Annabella kept her calm with the discipline of someone who knew the law's rhythms: wait, document, call witnesses, preserve the chain. She had her recorder in her shawl, and it continued to hum in the quiet like an insect. When Bento launched into a vicious monologue about how he had bought the cartorio and the tabelion, and how owning documents was the same as owning men, Annabella let him talk. Men like Bento talk when they feel safe. They disclose their own crimes as part of a victory lap. He began to name names, dates, transactions, proudly as if reciting a business ledger. And then, without fully realizing the weight of his words, he began to describe the night Afonso had been taken, precisely the way someone rehearsing a memory might. Bento told me to put pressure on Afonso, Valdir muttered at one point. The recording caught it. He wouldn't stop telling people about ownership. He was making trouble. We took care of it. We made sure he would not interfere. At that admission, Annabella felt the room swell with the sound of a single hard truth. Whether men intended or not, they sometimes speak to fill silence and end up filling their own graves. The recorder, tucked in the shawl's fold, recorded every sentence. Annabella sat with a kind of studied stillness. She did not shout, she did not cry. She listened, and in listening she gathered the confession she had come for. Bento's arrogance fed his own undoing. He began to catalog his operations like an accountant recounting a ledger of cruelty. He described schemes to transfer titles to shell companies, the names of notaries who signed, the way the town's fear kept farmers away from the courthouse. He boasted of men who intimidated those who might have spoken, and how he had paid off witnesses to forget what they had seen. But the crucial moment, Afonso's murder, was the center of a sudden gravity.
Bento recounted a night where things had not gone as cleanly as his business plan had required. His voice carried the pragmatic edge of someone who had once made a plan and then had to improvise when something unexpected happened. A man who had resisted too loudly, whose resistance had been inconvenient. He fought, Bento said into the warm, whiskey-smelling air. He would not stop. We had to. He paused, as if trying on different verbs. We made sure he wouldn't talk. Valdia's hands flexed. Junior stared at his father's face as if discovering a new shade of the man's history. Tiago's gaze dropped like someone who wished he could unsee a photograph on a wall. Annabella's recorder kept the whole exchange. It recorded Bento's voice naming men, nights, and methods. It recorded with the cold neutrality of technology, the human confession that the town had blamed on rumor for so long. The words, when later extracted and played for jurors, would not depend on memory alone. They would be a piece of sound that, if corroborated by documents and witness testimony, would present a vivid crime scene. When the tactical team approached the property under the cover of the helicopter's thrum, they did so following a precise choreography. Commander Neves watched the monitors as men fast-roped to a line near the Ingenio's rear entrance. The team moved with the quiet discipline of people trained to arrest without spectacle. They took positions at doors and windows. Their radio chatter was low, legal, and technical. They had the warrant, procured through rapid coordination with prosecutors who had been alerted by Annabella's uploads, and they had the evidence chain protocols to make the seizures meaningful in court. The insertion was swift. The team breached the back entrance and in a few sharp moments filled rooms with the smell of sweat and the tight breathing of men taken by surprise. Valdir's men reached for weapons and then found hands on their shoulders and cuffs clamping their wrists. The men who had moved in the safety of their own fear suddenly had to count the cost in legal terms. Bento tried to move, a last-taught animal of bravado. He made a small gesture toward the door, but Commander Neves intercepted him. "Sir," Neves said, voice flat and sure, "you are under arrest by the Federal Tactical Unit. You have the right to remain silent.
Anything you say may be used in court. Bento's face congealed for a moment, as if preparing to be photographed. He had built a life on the assumption that the law required money and influence. He now discovered that precision and timing could still reach him. Junior was taken next to him, bewildered, the costume of entitlement removed. Tiago, facing the weight of reality, sank to his knees and folded his face into his hands as if a child learning arithmetic. Amid the commotion, Annabella stood unbound. Someone, likely Tiago or Dona Elvira, or both, had slipped the rope from her wrists.
The recorder in her shawl had captured what it needed. The satchel had been found and its copies counted. The original ledgers, the missing heart of the cartorio, were still not physically recovered in that room. But the copies, the recorded confession, and the witness accounts were more than enough to secure immediate arrests and to create a probable cause for deeper searches. When the team made the seizures, they were careful. Commander Neves insisted on chain of custody forms executed on site. Each seized document was photographed, sealed, and catalogued. Evidence clerks took notes and attached digital stamps. Annabella watched, a judge more used to the solemnity of a court than to the quick, tactical noise of a raid, and she felt a small, administered relief. This was procedure as protection, the law's armor. In the days that followed, the legal machine churned forward. Indictments were drawn and filed. Names that had been whispered around fences, tabelions, notaries, and officials, were subpoenaed, and the shield that had protected Bento's empire began to peel. Assets were frozen under court orders. Companies with phantom addresses were placed under forensic audit. A task force was assembled, with Annabella in an overseeing role, not to preside over prosecutions, for that would be ethically improper, but to coordinate the judicial supervision that would ensure the town's interests were prioritized, the safe return of property, the protection of witnesses, the oversight of the cartorio's reconstruction. In the weeks that followed, the physical work of restoration began. The task force moved through lists of alleged fraudulent transfers. Men with clipboards read aloud names of families who had once farmed certain plots. Lawyers sat with trembling people and explained redress and restitution in straightforward terms. Dona Elvira stood at the back of one hearing and watched each name called, her fingers folded like someone counting a rosary of memory. The cartorio's originals had been moved to secure custody. Forensic examiners compared inks and stamps, painstakingly matching chain of evidence tags to Annabella's photographs. Each comparison was a small triumph over years of theft by paper. Where there had been forged transfers, certified originals now demonstrated rightful ownership. Where names had been scrubbed, signatures reappeared with the patient stubbornness of truth. Tiago cooperated with investigators. He gave testimony about movements he'd seen, about men who came and went at odd hours. He would later plead guilty to minor charges for failing to report crimes, and his sentence would be mitigated by his cooperation. He would become, in the town's slow stories, the young man who chose the other side of living. The community's forgiveness would not be instant. Trust requires time to knit. But his first steps in court were toward accountability.
At the formal arraignment, Bento listened as prosecutors read charges: forgery, formation of a criminal organization, coercion, and, most consequentially, the charge relating to Afonso Menezes' death. The recorded admissions and the copies Annabella had preserved gave the indictment teeth. There was evidence of payments, of falsified notarial acts, of threats made to persons who refused to sign. Annabella kept a deliberate distance in the courtroom. She could not preside over a case where she had been directly involved. Ethical rules required recusal. But she did not shrink from responsibility. She worked as a supervisor of the restitution program that would ensure that families had access to legal assistance and that the cartorio itself would be renovated and placed under transparent oversight. She helped design a verification system that would make the registry less susceptible to forgery, redundant digitization, a public ledger, and mandatory witness declarations for transfers. The town of Vila da Prata began to show the slow, stubborn signs of repair. Fields that had lain fallow under someone else's paper were returned to those whose names had been free of manufactured ink. Dona Elvira's small plot, returned to her after the court confirmed the forgery, became the first harvest in a season that smelled of newly tilled soil and the possibility of breakfasts that were entirely their own. The lanchonette reopened with a new sign painted by local hands. Children ran across the square with baskets of fruit, and the tomato stall that had witnessed Annabella's first public test was restocked. A small, decisive scene took place before the town's reconstructed cartorio.
A modest ceremony gathered villagers, a few dignitaries, and the people who had been most involved in the judicial process. The town's new task force, comprised of federal officers, local lawyers, and community representatives, announced a plan for the secure stewardship of land titles. The old cartorio's door, blackened with the memory of secrecy, had been reinstalled with new locks and an open registry that allowed community oversight. A plaque was set into the wall of the new public school that had opened in a repaired building. It bore a single line, Afonso Menezes, in memory of a man who wrote the town's records. The plaque did not promise miracle, it promised remembrance. Dona Elvira, with her silver braid, stood by the plaque and touched the letters as if they were a map. She turned to Annabella and handed her a tomato from the stall, a small bright circle of red. "You gave us that," she said. "A small thing, but it grows." Annabella felt grief and the quiet lift of something like closure. The plaque did not bring Afonso back, but it marked that his work had mattered and that his signature would not be erased again.
The town's children put on a small play in which the notary was shown reading truth aloud. The deputy was represented by a man whose costume fell apart, and the people celebrated that paper could be proof, not a prison. The legal aftermath was not neat. There were appeals, drawn-out civil actions by intermediary entities, and negotiations over parcels with complex title histories. The federal courts moved with the kind of plodding thoroughness that can be mistaken for slowness when what a community wants is immediate vindication. But in room after room, clerks stamped copies, judges signed orders, and municipal registries reopened for public inspection. Land restitution occurred under supervised hearings where each claimant had counsel. Asset seizures were turned into funds to invest in local infrastructure, roads, and the school that would bear Afonso's name. Bento's trial was long and thorough. The recorded confession, the chain of custody documentation, the corroborating testimony of witnesses and experts provided a constellation of proof. The jury listened to hours of evidence, the forgeries exposed in forensic analysis, bank transfers traced to shell entities, and the precise metadata that tied Annabella's photographs to the cartorio itself. In the end, the verdict reflected not the immediate catharsis of revenge, but the sober work of the law, conviction based on standards of proof beyond reasonable doubt. After the trial, Annabella oversaw, at the court's behest, the implementation of a permanent oversight mechanism for land registry in regions vulnerable to the same corruption. She convened a panel that included local voices like Dona Elvira, technical experts, and members of the federal unit to write binding policy. This task force would not only repair titles, but also train locals to safeguard their own paperwork, education as a civic prophylactic. The town began to recover more than land. People came back to the square with a different posture. They still remembered nights of silence when a man with muscle and forged ink could make ownership into a personal currency. They remembered the names of those who had left and sold out under duress. But they also remembered a woman in a blurry hat who had stepped off a bus and refused to be nobody. They told stories over coffee and under trees. A small festival, once quieted by fear, bloomed each year in a celebration of harvest and the courage to name wrongdoing. Annabella returned to the city with a record of the operation in hand and a cautious satisfaction. She had supervised processes that returned land to families, had watched men who once thought themselves untouchable escorted in paths, and had helped design a system meant to be more resilient. She did not imagine herself a hero. She thought of Afonso and the way small habits of an honest scrivener, initialing a margin, had become a breadcrumb back to truth. She thought of Tiago and his awkward oath to do the right thing.
She thought of Dona Elvira's hands, which had pushed against a man larger than herself. The media spun versions of the story, some accurate, some less so. They called it the tale of a judge disguised as a traveler who exposed a deputy's mafia. The headline was not wrong. Annabella had disguised herself to avoid tipping off the men who would burn the books at the first sign of a parade of law. But the bare bones of the headline could not carry the subtler curriculum of process, the tireless notarizations, the chain of custody, the patient cataloging of data that allowed a court to do its work. People prefer to overlook the procedural scaffolding in favor of a single figure. Annabella understood the human hunger for a simple story, but she also knew the story's reality needed to include the slow machinery of justice. Years later, Vila da Prata's festival took on a new ritual. Children ran through the square, carrying tiny replicas of ledgers tied with red string.
There was a stall where women sold tomatoes, bright and stubborn in their own right, and the mayor, someone new and less compromised, spoke at the foot of the fountain about civic responsibility. The cartorio displayed a framed page, Afonso's initials in the margin, clear and defiant. People touched the glass and remembered. Annabella visited once, not as a stranger now, but as a quiet steward of an outcome she had helped shape. She walked barefoot through a child-tended garden and placed her hands on the low wall of the school named in Afonso's honor. She thought of the thinness of life and the stubbornness of paper. She thought of the line that separates law from lawlessness and how crucial it is that people choose to work within its frames, even when injustice simmers and threatens. She also thought of limits. The victory in Vila da Prata did not exercise corruption everywhere. It was a local weather change that might not alter the climate, but it did transform how a community related to its memory. It taught them that documents could be both shields and chains, and that a town's work must be to protect the integrity of those documents with as much vigilance as it protected its fields. At the center of the town's new memory sat a small monument to ordinary courage, a bench on the square where people could sit and talk about what had been lost, and what they had repaired together. On the bench's plaque was a short line, "For those who refuse to look away." People still paused there, they still argued, they still mourned. Justice, as Annabella knew, is often less a single high note than a long, steady chorus. The rumors about Annabella's brave disguise muttered on in the city and in the bars along the highway. Some called it a moral parable, others cast it as a dangerous precedent. But the town of Vila da Prata had reclaimed its names and its fields.
The ledger lines that once were curtains of theft were now pages for people who could read and verify and defend their own histories. In the end, the judge who had worn a shawl and bought tomatoes in a square returned to her city work, but not without carrying with her the smell of dust and the warmth of small hands. She had not sought glory, she had sought truth. The title of the story, "The Judge Disguised as Poor to Expose a Deputy's Mafia and Built an Empire of Terror," was a press-ready condensation of a braver, more complicated thing. Law practiced as a public craft and sustained by people who, however quietly, chose to stand up. If you found this story moving, consider subscribing. There are many such stories in towns like Vila da Prata, waiting to be told. Months later, the federal inspectors returned to Vila da Prata not as invaders, but as partners. They trained young clerks in the cartorio, implemented a digital registry with redundant backups, and established a hotline where villagers could report suspicious activity anonymously. The land that had been stolen was not magically restored overnight. Legal redress takes hearings, confirmations, and sometimes public hearings where testimony must be cross-checked. But the town saw in those daylight hearings its history corrected in small public acts, a signature revalidated, a parcel returned, a child's name restored to an old deed. Bento and his chief lieutenants served their sentences. The prison terms did not erase the harm, nor did they close the circle of broken trust. A number of the deputy's former clients also pursued civil remedies against him, and his assets, houses, trucks, the sugar mill's holdings, were seized and placed under court supervision. Some assets were used to create a restitution fund. Others were sold to pay legal costs and to subsidize rebuilding efforts. Legal processes are never painless, and they are often bitter. For many families, the court's calendar meant months of waiting, the grind of paperwork, and the necessity of telling their stories again and again. But the system had produced tangible results: titles restored, a public registry reformed, and a community less inclined to treat silence as the only option. On a quiet morning when the sun hit the square at an angle that meant work and a good day's chance at harvest, Annabella met with Dona Elvira and Tiago near the old fountain. Tiago had cut his hair shorter and took work in road maintenance. He still lived in the town. He had chosen to stay, partly because the scars of leaving were heavy, and partly because he had begun to imagine another version of himself. "You did what you came to do," Dona Elvira said, leaning on a cane like punctuation. "You took the trouble to be ordinary in the right way." Annabella shrugged against the little weight of it all. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "A lot of people did small things." Tiago, who had once moved like a shadow, looked at her with a new steadiness.
"We kept the books," he said simply. "We kept the names." That was the center of the matter. Names kept. Not temporary headlines, or even the excitement of an arrest. Names kept. Ownership recognized. A village's memory restored. That is a kind of justice that works slowly but endures. Annabella walked away from the fountain and the school and the cartorio and the square where she had first offered a tomato. She carried in her pocket a small picture, Afonso's photo, and she placed it, later, in a drawer with case files. She did not hang it in public. She preferred that the boy who had once shouted her name in the bus stop remember that kindness, not the dramatic arc of a courtroom. Justice, she knew, thrives in small actions, not only in trials and verdicts, but in the day-to-day labor of guarding truth. The legend of the disguised judge would be told in many versions, a woman who walked into a town and changed its destiny. The better version would be the one told by those who lived the work, not just Annabella, but the clerk who decided to speak, the lady who sold coffee and watched for signals, and the boy who chose to call a federal number. The title line, about a judge disguised as poor exposing a deputy's empire of terror, was true in headline and false in simplification. It shielded the many hands that had toiled to make the law a living instrument, rather than a shadow used for intimidation.